What is an interesting story from history that most people probably don't know about? The death of the poet Lord Byron. This guy was eccentric AF. One day Byron, who was English, decided he was going to help the Greeks fight for independence from the Ottomans. He spent his own money to outfit the Greek fleet and took command of part of the Greek army even though he had no military experience. Then he randomly died of a fever. He's still considered a hero in Greece and there's a famous statue of him in Athens. The voyage of the Russian Baltic fleet in the Russo-Japanese War, and particularly the Dogger Bank incident. Russia is losing badly to the Japanese. The Tsar sends the Baltic fleet on a long, difficult voyage. The fleet is inexperienced and the ships outdated. They panic and mistakenly attack British fishing trawlers, nearly causing war with Britain. The fleet must now sail around Africa, fighting off imaginary threats and adopting exotic pets. In Madagascar, they accidentally hit their own cruiser during a funeral. During gunnery practice, they hit the ship towing the target instead. Eventually, their hospital ship is spotted by a Japanese vessel, leading to the disastrous Battle of Tsushima, where Russia suffers major losses. This event influenced Japanese naval doctrine before World War II. The eagle that's been depicted on many US coins and currency was modeled after a real eagle named Peter. He lived near the Philadelphia Mint in the early 1800s and was eventually killed by flying into the coining machinery. He was stuffed and used as a model ever since. When Yuri Gagarin returned to Earth after being the first man in space, he landed 300 kilometers off target and surprised a farmer and his daughter in Kazakhstan. Clad in a bright orange spacesuit, he assured them he was a fellow Soviet citizen and asked to borrow their phone to call Moscow for a ride. In Greece's fight for independence, a Turkish garrison in the Acropolis was besieged. When they ran low on bullets, they began dismantling marble columns for lead. The Greeks sent them bullets and told them not to harm the columns. Garibaldi, known for uniting Italy, had an adventurous life. After a failed revolution in Piedmont, he fled to South America, fought in Uruguay, then returned to lead military campaigns in Italy. He conquered large parts of the country almost single-handedly and gave them to the king. He later retired to an island with a year's supply of pasta. During Apollo 10, the dress rehearsal for the moon landing, communications were interrupted while astronauts found a turd floating around the spacecraft. Check the transcripts. During a pirate attack in 1717, a 9-year-old boy named John King joined the pirates. His remains were identified in a wrecked pirate ship in 2007. During Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, he began a relationship with Pauline Fours, the wife of an officer. Her husband was sent away but returned unexpectedly. He divorced her, and she became Napoleon's official mistress in Egypt. She later made a fortune and lived in Paris with pet monkeys and parrots. The first major battle of the American Civil War was fought on Wilmer McLean's farm. He moved to Appomattox, and 4 years later, the Civil War ended with Lee's surrender in his parlor. He later said, "The Civil War started in my front yard and ended in my front parlor." Tycho Brahe partied all night without urinating, which caused a fatal bladder or kidney condition. R.I.P. Tycho. Ohio and the Michigan Territory fought over the city of Toledo. Napoleon was involved in a snowball fight while in military school. It got so violent that teachers had to break it up. When Hernán Cortés and his conquistadors first arrived in Mexico, they met a native woman called Dona Marina, who traveled with them and became their main translator and rarely left Cortés' side. When she was young, she was secretly sold to another tribe by her stepfather because he wanted his son to have firstborn rights. This tribe then sold her to another tribe where she was adopted by a person of very high rank. By the time she met Cortés, she was a person of the greatest importance and was obeyed without question by the Indians throughout New Spain. Cortés and his men traveled further into New Spain, until they arrived in the town where her parents who sold her lived. In one of the conquistadors who witnessed the event's own words, and quote, "These relations were in great fear of Dona Marina, for they thought that she had sent for them to put them to death, and they were weeping. When Dona Marina saw them in tears, she consoled them and told them to have no fear, that when they had given her over to the men from Zicalango, they knew not what they were doing, and she forgave them for doing it," end quote, and she gave them many jewels of gold, and raiment, and told them to return to their town, and said that God had been very gracious to her in freeing her from the worship of idols and making her a Christian, and letting her bear a son to her lord and master Cortés and in marrying her to such a gentleman as Juan Jaramillo, who was now her husband. That she would rather serve her husband and Cortés than anything else in the world, and would not exchange her place to be cacica of all the provinces in New Spain. During the 1919 Paris Peace Conference ending World War I, a university student rented some formal clothing, drafted a petition arguing for the independence of his home country based on Wilson's own 14 points, and presented his petition to the American delegation. The Americans dismissed the unimportant student from an obscure country. That student was a young Ho Chi Minh, and he was arguing for the independence of Vietnam from the French. It's a bit of a wider area than what some others are suggesting, but I feel it still fits in the vein of things most people don't know. Japan was shut off from the outside world for over 200 years, in a period called Sakoku. Pretty much everyone knows about Japanese honor and whatnot, but I don't think many people understand quite the effect 2 centuries of isolation has on such a thing. At the same time though, they had one tiny sliver of contact through a town they built called Dejima, which hosted a very small number of Europeans. Western influences trickled in very slowly through Dejima, and you can delve into great detail about what influences occurred through Rangaku, which is what they called the small influence of the Europeans, mainly the Dutch. I'd highly recommend looking up Sakoku, and if you are already familiar with that, Rangaku. Lots of interesting perspectives there, and you can really see how Japan was forged, right up to the start of the Meiji Restoration. I'm fond of Alfred Wintle, another English eccentric. The entire Wikipedia article is entertaining. Here's a characteristic anecdote. After the French surrender, Wintle demanded an aircraft, with which he intended to rally the French Air Force to fly their planes to Britain and continue fighting Germany from British air bases. When refused, he threatened an RAF officer, Air Commodore A.R. Boyle, with a gun. It was alleged that he had threatened to shoot himself and Boyle, and for this he was imprisoned in the Tower of London. On the way to his prison, the lieutenant colonel was escorted by a young soldier via train. The soldier is reported to have lost the arrest warrant. Disgusted by this, Wintle declared the man incompetent, told him to wait where he was and went to get a new warrant. Since there was no other officer of higher rank at the warrant office, he signed the paper himself. I don't have a source for this, but I was reading something in the novel Lost to the West, the forgotten Byzantine Empire that saved Western civilization. It was talking about how there was no divorce in the medieval Catholic world, but the Pope could grant annulments on certain grounds. So 2 nobles are married in an arranged marriage but find out they don't like each other, so the marriage is never consummated. Their friends urge them to procreate so they can have heirs, but they refuse. After a while, they are locked in a room together. After 1 week, and no consummation, the Pope grants them an annulment on the grounds of mutual hatred. The capture of the Dutch fleet at Den Helder might be one of the most ridiculous and effective attacks of all time. A large number of Dutch warships were docked at Den Helder during a particularly cold winter. Suddenly, the dock froze over. The ships were trapped. A French cavalry regiment saw this and decided that they would charge the ships. They wrapped cloth around the hooves of the horses to soften their blow against the ice and charged the Dutch as they slept. They took every ship with no casualties. This is the only instance in history of a cavalry charge against a naval fleet. Centuries ago, having molten gold poured down your throat was actually the preferred means of death by molten metal. Marcus Licinius Crassus, an astoundingly wealthy Roman general, is rumored to have died this way, as is Roman Emperor Valerian the Elder, though others contest that he was flayed alive. Centuries ago, having molten gold poured down your throat was actually the preferred means of death by molten metal. Marcus Licinius Crassus, an astoundingly wealthy Roman general, is rumored to have died this way, as is Roman Emperor Valerian the Elder, though others contest that he was flayed alive. Marco Antonio Bragadin. He was a Venetian commander in charge of the defenses of Famagusta on Cyprus. Despite having medieval walls and a force that was vastly outnumbered by Turks, Bragadin managed to hold out for 9 months waiting for Venice to save him, his men, and the townsfolk of Famagusta. The city was the only thing preventing the Ottomans from completely conquering the island. Venice tried desperately to raise the forces needed to drive the Ottomans off of Cyprus. They allied with the Papal States, but it was still not enough. The only country that could help them was Spain, who dragged their feet the entire 9 months preparing people, ships, and eventually traveling to Cyprus. If they hadn't, the relief forces would have made it on time to relieve Bragadin. Instead, he surrendered to the Turks, asking only that the townspeople and his men be allowed to go free. They agreed, but immediately cut off Bragadin's nose and ears and pressed him into forced labor for all the trouble, grief, and death he had given the Turks. After those 2 weeks they tied him to a column and began skinning him starting at his feet. He died when they reached his waist. The Turks finished the job, stuffed the skin, and then paraded it around their empire to show their people what happens when you defy the Ottomans. Bragadin's skin was later purloined from the Constantinople's arsenal in 1580 by the young Venetian seaman, Girolamo Polidori, who was there on business. He brought it back to Venice, where it was received as a returning hero. The skin was preserved first in the church of San Gregorio, then interred with full honors in the Basilica di San Giovanni e Paolo, where it still is. Preventing the Ottomans from taking Cyprus would have completely changed the outcome of the later half of the 16th century and into the 17th century. There are countless stories about Benjamin Franklin, but what I've always found interesting was his family life. Ben was engaged when he was just a poor printer's apprentice. She was also of a middle-class family and her name was Deborah Reed. They were engaged before Ben traveled to Europe, and once he saw the possibilities to marry a richer woman overseas, he wrote Deborah a letter simply stating, and quote, "I'll be here a while," end quote. Ben eventually came back with an illegitimate son and Deborah had a husband that abandoned her, so they moved in together as a common-law marriage. They had son and daughter. Tragically, their son died as a child from smallpox. Later, Ben's illegitimate son, William, had only one son of his own, Temple, who was also illegitimate. Temple was raised mostly by Benjamin and grew up to having a set of illegitimate twins, a boy and a girl. Sadly, his son also died as a child from smallpox. A sad story, but always interesting to me.